If you have stuck around for this long, if you are a weekly listener, got notifications turned on, you are liked, you are commenting, you are subscribed, you have already left a review wherever you're from, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, because we're on Apple Podcasts now. Wherever you're from, please leave me a review. It helps so much. It helps get this whole thing out in front of more people. It helps. Thank you. Always let me know in the comments what you think, if the topic, if it resonated with you, if it didn't, please give me the feedback. I appreciate it. With all that being said, yes, I am taking clients. If you're interested in one-on-one coaching, that's something we can do. We as in me, myself, and I don't have a team of coaches. That's not really my style. There's nothing wrong with that. But this is a me, myself, and I kind of thing. Whether you are a competitor or not, whether you are looking to get into competing or not get into competing, maybe you're looking to get out of competing and you're like, I want the attention to detail that competitors get, or that you perceive I would give. I want that. I just don't actually want to get on stage. That's amazing. Let's do it. That is my dream. That's actually my preferred type of client. Let's take it really seriously without having that pressure of actually getting on stage. That keeps it fun. That keeps it really fun. In all seriousness, lifestyle clients, yes, accepting those as well, accepting you guys. It does not have to be for a competition. It does not have to be because you are even necessarily working towards a deadline, a finish line. It could just be hey, I haven't been able to find success on my own. I've been working at it. I've been doing a lot of things that I think are correct, but there's some kind of disconnect, some things happening along the way. I'm not able to be 100% on track. I'm not able to put forth the kind of effort I would if I was, let's say, doing a show, but I still want to be moving. I still want to be moving forward. I do not want to be regressing. I don't want to be losing progress. If that is you, please let me know. Calendly link is in the show notes. One-time consults. You are not locked into anything. That can be lab work. That can be training design, training programming. That can be just drug talk. We can just talk PEDs if you want 45 minutes of me just not shutting up about whatever topic it is. You're not locked into anything. It is truly just that, a one-time consult. If you have a coach and you're we're good. Our relationship is good. We just need some outside help. We need some insight into some of these aspects that are a little more complex, maybe out of your coach's current scope of practice. Come through, bring your coach. It can be a little thing. It can be a thing that we do all together. It'll be fun. I do this oftentimes where I third wheel a coaching relationship, and it's just hey, this is my perspective. This is what I would do. Okay, now y'all decide what you're going to do from here. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. What are we talking about today? So I had a call a few days ago. Client is coming out of kind of a shitty relationship with her last coach. A few key points that she mentioned is just being run into the ground unnecessarily, a ton of body fat to lose, but out the gate signs with this coach for 6 months, a year, maybe. It was a long contract. And she's immediately. And she's not it's not she's 4'11", 100 pounds. She's I'm 5'5". I'm at a higher body fat. I've competed previously and I would like to continue to compete, but where I'm at right now, I need to lose body fat. I would like to go into a prep and out the gate, 1,000 calories out the gate, 7 sessions of cardio a week at an hour. And, she communicated, she's hey, this is aggressive. I'm not going to be able to stick to this. And I mean, she's interviewing me because obviously this is not going to be something she continues with. Dare I say, her and her coach are clashing. They're clashing, or at least maybe not in the literal sense, they are not seeing eye to eye. She is no longer happy. And after I got off this call, it gave me, I paused and I was okay, because one thing she mentioned on the call, she was I didn't get my calories up high enough. And that was the justification for bringing calories so low immediately. And I was okay, well, what do you mean? where were your calories at prior to starting the deficit? Or the fat loss phase. She's like, well, she was at like 1,800 when she hired him. And, him already, I'm doxing, hired him. So immediately out the gate, 800 calories off the food just to create that 800 calorie deficit from food. And then realistically another, she's in a massive deficit. I'm thinking at least like a 1,500 calorie deficit a day, just doing some loose math. But what sat with me, what I immediately wrote this down. I was like, I want to talk about this on the next podcast because I agree with her that hey, week 1, week 2, week 3 of this fat loss phase, that's way too much. That's way too much. But what stood out to me that was an indicator, I was like, I think a lot of people get this part wrong, is she's like, we didn't get my food high enough. And that's why I was dieting on such low calories. So let me take a step back. She was of the belief, yes, this is too aggressive, but she also believed this is what was necessary for her to lose weight. And I was like, okay, hold on. lot to unpack here. My thoughts on this. A lot of people have this concept around food ultimately dictating how high you get your calories in a non-dieting phase, that dictating how hard a diet's going to be moving forward. Now, I tend to disagree. I tend to think how high you get your calories in the non-dieting phase, I don't think that plays nearly as much of a role in someone's ability to lose fat, assuming that we're talking about, in this case, someone who did get their calories up to 1,800. She threw out a number that was she's like, yeah, I really should have gotten them up closer to 22, 24, 26. So only getting to 18, that was devastating. And I'm like, okay, we're missing some context here, because it's if you were doing a lot of cardio, there's definitely ways, all over the place. There's definitely ways we could get up to 24, 26, 2,800 calories as your off season, threshold. I'm not a fan of doing so and continuing to systematically raise food at the expense of increasing cardio or keeping cardio a constant in your off season, in your growth phase, in your non-dieting phase. I don't believe in that. I think there's a little bit of a disconnect when it comes to we must keep cardio at a minimum, at this minimum threshold, and we can't go under this. We can't completely remove it for the bikini athlete, let's say, yet we're consistently pushing up food. I hate all of that. So the idea being when we're in this non-dieting phase, okay, the focus is to set you up for better outcomes your next fat loss phase. And yes, the component of working food up from dieting calories, fully on board with that. So let me be clear. I'm not saying, oh, you shouldn't increase food. What I'm saying is as food goes up, there is a point where we need to be very careful that we're not forgetting about the cardio requirements in this non-dieting phase, because ultimately, if our goal in the non-dieting phase is to grow, if it's to put on tissue or at least drop off a shit ton of dietary fatigue, cardio, structured cardio, if we're talking about stairs, but even incline walking, truly structured cardio is going to be the biggest catalyst for fatigue. That is going to be the thing that is driving likely the most fatigue out of all of our variables, training, step count. Sure, you could argue sleep. If sleep is so poor, that can definitely drive up fatigue. Assuming we're talking about inputs, any kind of stimulus that thereby fatigue is going to be generated from. Cardio for sure is our number one. And I think when it comes to the bikini athlete and this idea we need to make the next diet easier. Yeah, we need to make it not unnecessarily hard. But dieting, like the actual process of losing body fat, sure, it's affected as adaptations occur. The perception of how hard a diet is going to play a large role in the athlete's like satisfaction and enjoyment and ability to adhere, But like when we rip away the perception and all of the qualitative metrics that really play a role in determining how well someone was dieted, when we just look at what's needed for someone to diet, we talk about a 1 pound loss per week, 20 pounds. Okay, it's a 500 calorie deficit for 20 weeks. And sure, I'm someone who's of the belief like we should have a diet break in there. Maybe we should be a little more aggressive on the front end, like the first 8 to 10 weeks versus the last 8 to 10 weeks, meaning we should have a higher target rate of change. Maybe instead of a 1%, it should be 1.2% or 1.3%, maybe even a 1.5% if the athlete's enhanced. Really, when I start to pull back those layers, I'm like, there is a minimum suck that's going to come like from what is required to lose that weight. What is required to lose that weight will not change though. And I know I'm 12 minutes in and I'm just getting to the point, but seriously, the idea that like we're going into these fat loss phases and we don't know what it's going to take. We do know. A 1 pound drop per week is a 500 calorie deficit always. How you create the deficit, that will change. That can change. It doesn't have to change, actually. If you find a good system in place and you can recreate that environment and it's effective and it's suitable for the conditions, amazing. But I'm like really hammering this down. What is actually required physiologically will not change. Now, sure, if you don't have some kind of thyroid supportive therapies like HRT, but for thyroid, if you don't have that in place, it can feel harder, and the conversion that's going to facilitate these metabolic processes will technically be harder, but it's still 1 pound a week, 500 calorie deficit a day, always, all the time, every time, actually. So the concept around like if her food had been higher in the off season, that would have made the physiological process of losing fat easier. I disagree. I think that, and just knowing like who she was working with and like just generally the approach, I have a feeling, I wish I would have asked for clarity because it's going to drive me crazy. I have a feeling her cardio was very high previously in order to achieve those high intakes. Because I think she'd mentioned like I got up to 2,400, but I like really wanted to shoot for like 28. Like I wanted it to be really high. So whenever I started the diet, I could go down to not 1,000 calories, which I'm not even saying like she shouldn't have been at 1,000 calories out the gate. She shouldn't have, but she should have been in enough of a deficit regardless of her starting point. Creating that deficit should have been adequate. Now, I think the concept around like getting food high, I think it can be very misleading because if we're continuing to have cardio in, well, it's like, sure, food is higher, but you're burning straight through that. Like you're burning through food via cardio. So it's kind of a net wash, kind of even a net negative when you consider that like the cardio will take away from your training performance. Now, there's going to be someone that's like, yo, are you saying do no cardio in the off season? I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm not saying like everyone should be at zero cardio. Some cardio is going to be beneficial. And depending on where adherence is, depending on if you're someone who is very petite, some of my more petite athletes, like yes, even in the off season, even when they're not dieting, we still have to have cardio in place just to ensure that their calories aren't stupid low in this phase. But I think if we're talking about just simply, hey, we need this off season to be effective and we need it to set you up for an easier fat loss phase. Okay, cool. What are those metrics and like, are those metrics actually indicative of you having an easier time next time you diet? Now for me, the big one The big one is going to be consistency with adherence. In the off season, that shouldn't be a time where adherence is spotty. If you're struggling to be consistent, yes, we might need to raise food and do so in a way that maybe does result in a higher or faster rate of gain. But I don't want to go back and forth playing that pull-push game where like we're kind of dicking around for several months, kind of in a deficit, kind of not in a deficit. Oh, okay, like you can't be adherent, so now we're going to pull down and do mini cut, only to have you splurge like the proceeding like next 3-4 weeks. It needs to make sense. And if someone is really having a hard time in that state, rather than consistently tell them like, hey, I need you to be at this low intake, I would tell them like, we need to increase food because we need to build in some kind of equity to prove to yourself that you can actually stick to something, because it can be very defeating. And it can be something that over time, like I know I talked about this last episode, that you can begin to develop a belief that you're bad at dieting, that you don't have the discipline. I think it's important as a coach to recognize this and to recognize when the program itself, like it might be optimal, but it is not suitable for this athlete in this condition at this point. Even if an athlete is 100% adherent, is the diet hard for them to follow? If it's taking a lot of willpower, I mean, it's not if, it's when they break, when they begin to deviate. And I think once adherence goes, once that becomes spotty, I mean, like it's really hard to walk that back, especially if the coach is not involved in like the behaviors around this and like the culprits behind why non-adherence is even becoming a thing. Now, the other part of this is training performance. Training performance should be going up in this non-dieting phase. If training performance is slipping, if the athlete isn't as focused on those incremental improvements, and we've talked about this several points, but like progressive overload is not exclusive to just adding more weight to whatever exercises you're doing. It can be in the form of improving the skill of the movement. It can be in the form of progressing to a harder modality, even incorporating like tempo training, reducing rest periods, just globally improving in some aspect. Just increasing weight. I mean, that's one variable we can manipulate, which ultimately I think you run out of runway in that aspect on a lot of exercises. Like the amount of people who are like, yo, I cannot progress on laterals. Like when I go from like 10s to 12s, when I try to go to 15, like my form just falls apart. It's like, yeah, I know, like that's going to be the case for a while. We have to get creative with how we're going to make progressions for exercises like that have very low ceilings for which we can progress load. But having some kind of quantifiable way to see that performance is going up. Yes, that is how I'm measuring the effectiveness of this off season, the ability in which this athlete is going to have an easier time dieting. Not necessarily that the physiological process of dieting, it's not like, okay, if you have a really good off season, the next time you diet in order to lose 1 pound, that caloric value that's needed to lose that 1 pound goes down. That's not what easier is. Easier, at least my interpretation of this, how I like to think about it, how I conceptualize easier, is your perception around doing the things that are required to create that deficit. Now, sure, muscle gain will make it easier. Muscle gain will increase your BMR. It's going to increase the amount of calories that you burn just doing nothing, being sick, being stuck in bed, not actually getting up and doing anything. Like muscle building is a really good tool in this regard, because if you put on more muscle, you're not going to likely have to get as lean as if you were under-muscled and had to diet to an extent to get the right visibility in areas that are under-muscled, i.e. your glute tie-in. If that's an area that you have a deficit in from a muscularity standpoint, yeah, adding more muscle, it's going to make your perception of getting as lean as you need to easier, because you might not actually have to diet as long or as aggressively, or have the stress of like, okay, the rest of my body is peeled inside out, but my tie-ins, they're lagging. They're falling behind. So for sure, that can technically make it easier. Staying a little bit leaner in the off season. So Therefore, having a higher P ratio of like total cumulative weight that you've gained. So people will say like, I'm 20 pounds above stage weight and I accumulated those 20 pounds over the course of 6, 7, 8 months even. Okay, sick. How much of that increase is muscle to fat? Well, we're talking about 20 pounds. Like, did you gain 10 pounds of muscle and 10 pounds of fat? That would be ridiculous. Like, we're talking about someone who truly is like a newbie athlete, like untrained. Fuck. And like, even then, I'm not even going to say like that's necessarily possible in just 6 months. I mean, that would be quite a lot. In the course of a year for a completely new athlete, perhaps maybe if they have body parts that are super like just completely untapped, maybe they've never trained their back. Maybe they completely forgot about upper body, I guess if they're untrained, there was no training history, but let's say they go and they completely like build out their physique and they add quality tissue everywhere. That would be ridiculous. But 10 pounds of muscle and 10 pounds of fat, that's even a year. I don't even know if I want to like commit to saying that that's possible for a completely new athlete. But just for simplicity's sake, a 1-to-1 ratio, 5 pounds of muscle in a year, 5 pounds of fat. I mean, that's a very, very favorable P ratio. That's a very good spot to be in. But what likely is going to happen is that you're going to add tissue, but it's going to be very gradual. You're going to add some fat, and maybe initially those incremental progressions in scale weight, maybe you don't see the fat come on because you're adding tissue at roughly the same rate. But as body fat begins to go up, as you become less insulin sensitive, maybe there is a higher discrepancy of body fat. Maybe food is so high that you're starting to notice how that looks. Being able to assess and really like cut off the weight gain at the point in which it's no longer productive, that will make your next diet easier. That will make it to where you didn't accrue so much body fat that you actually now the diet is harder. It's a big point of contention for people because you have a lot of people who are like, hey, I want to grow. I don't want to add any body fat. I know some of it's going to come on, but how do I know when I'm at the point when I've hit the max? And this was actually a question I got asked yesterday on a podcast I did. What is the body fat percentage in which it's too high? And like, I really try to avoid giving exact percentages because I think taking body fat percentages as a whole can be very, very skewed, can be very inaccurate. I think globally, like relying on weight is going to be a little bit more telling for female athletes, for natural athletes. And for me, like, I mean, I've competed previously. I was fucking like, last time I was on stage, the first show of that season, I was 117. Like, I was tiny. I was very small. Second show, had an anabolic in place, had much more food in place, was a fuller look. I competed like 123. That was my stage weight. So if I were to say, okay, what's 20 pounds above my stage weight? Because that's generally when I would cut off like any kind of continued progression in scale weight. Well, that would be 143. Well, I've hit that, but I've been off stage for a while. I've also built more muscle. So can we safely assume that my stage weight, is higher than it was previously? Yeah. But even with that prediction, even with that assessment of like, okay, well, still we're working with that 20, 25 pound like cutoff point. Okay. I mean, I'm going to be conservative. I'm not going to be like, oh, you gained 7 pounds of muscle. That would be ridiculous. I don't believe I did. That's quite a bit of muscle. And for someone who's not untrained, that would be impressive without an anabolic, honestly. Without an ancillary anabolic, TRT has still been in place. Not saying I'm natural, but okay, I digress. But would I continue to let that upper end of the range of where I cut off weight gain, would I continue to let that go up systematically? Not necessarily. I mean, like 143 is still very heavy for me, but having more muscle, it's a lot easier for me to sit at 143 and not hate the way I look, not feel completely unproductive than it was, let's say 5 years ago. Shit. I mean, 2014, that's when I started doing my first show. Like I was tiny then. Like 10 years ago, 143 would have been a problem. That would have been a very high body fat percentage. Measuring the effectiveness of your off season versus doing what you need to do in order to make your next diet easier. Similar, more similar than dissimilar. And yes, calories, walking up calories to a point is smart. But I found that over the last few years, I've really gotten away from this blanket idea of like food needs to be so high in order for me to feel like my next diet will be easier. It would be great if it was, but not at the expense of having an excessive amount of cardio in place to sustain a high caloric intake, not at the expense of raising body fat so high that now this is unproductive. It's largely body fat gain that's coming on. Really not even at the expense of it being difficult for me to maintain such a high intake, which some people do struggle with. Like I talked about this a few episodes ago about the individual who's like, I'm struggling getting in this food. If you're struggling getting in the food and you still have like a high amount of cardio in place, that cardio is like the high calories are predicated on you having a large amount of cardio in. You remove the cardio, you can actually get away with eating less, which for some people, they might be like, wait, so if I do cardio, I can eat more? Well, yeah, but there's only a certain amount of cardio that really, like the threshold in which, or I guess the capacity in which you put cardio in, it can be helpful, but it shouldn't be used as a crutch. And I think moving away from that idea of let's keep the cardio in order to allow you to eat more, I think that is a very slippery slope. A lot of people will chase that number without realizing that the number itself is not representative of an easier time losing weight. Your perception around the weight loss is largely going to dictate whether it's easy or not. And for me, for myself, but also for clients, like I think this is going to come down to fatigue management. Fatigue management, having a plan, having an adequate target rate of loss that's not excessive, but is aggressive enough to make the most of the time spent in the deficit. So one thing I want to touch on, because like this has come up several times in comments in previous episodes and then in the DMs, is like, what are the thresholds in which in season versus off season I would put cardio to, or I would put calories to? So just globally, like in the off season, the higher cardio is, and this, I guess, saying this now, I'm like, I fucking should have led with this. That would have been much more organized in terms of the thought process. If you are in your off season at 30 minutes of cardio a day, I mean, stairs are going to be much more fatiguing than an incline walking, but incline walking, like I had a free motion treadmill. Like at one point that was in my apartment, and like, I would jack that thing up to 15%. Like 15% incline walking is no longer LISS. That is miss, if not hiss, like high intensity, steady state. Like it was a lot. Like my heart rate was 140, 150. Like it was intense. It created the deficit. It served the purpose. But like doing that, even like, okay, I'll just take a step back. Doing it at like 5%, 3 miles an hour, it's not as intense as stairs. But regardless, either modality, even doing the one that is less fatiguing, incline walking, 30 minutes a day, 6-7 days a week, like we're talking about 180 to 210 minutes for your weekly total. By putting your cardio there in order to justify a higher caloric intake, that means that you are going to be starting your diet with less runway, less mobility in terms of pushing cardio up. Like I had a girl this season who came to me. She's a little bit older and she's like, hey, I'm going to compete. I want to compete under you. And she's in a good spot. But like the one thing that stood out, she's like, I don't have a lot of time left in the sport. I want to compete frequently. And I can respect that. I can respect that. Like, no, you might not be in the best position. And to some extent we can manipulate, we can work around that. But like I did the same thing with nursing school. I was like, I'm not as muscled as I need to be, but I'm going to compete anyway. If that means I have to take some degree of compensation to accommodate for that and get leaner than I need to be because I'm under muscled, cool, I'll do that. In this client's case, she's like, my cardio, she's like, it's already 180, or I think it was like 180, 190, like give or take. So to start off, to create the deficit for her, because she was coming from an off season, I'm like her food wasn't crazy high either. So I'm like, it's not great. And I mean, like we're going to need to rely on some fat loss tools. Cardio is going to have to go up from here. Food is going to have to go down. the perception around this might be that it is harder than you're comfortable with. And she was great. Like, she was such a trooper. She's like, no, I've been doing this like 15 years. So honestly, I'm okay. 15 years. How does that even make sense? Because bikini, has it even been around 15 years? Probably not. My math is not mathing. She's been doing it a long time. I don't know why I threw out 15. That wouldn't even make sense. But in this case, we escalated cardio up. I mean, week 1 brought it to 250. I mean, it was a sizable increase. And she had like a 15-week prep. Like, she didn't have a ton of weight, but I was like, I want to make sure that you have enough time to get as lean as you can, because historically you haven't gotten as lean as you need to be. I want to accommodate for like, hey, she might not have enough runway to lose at a higher percentage off the rip. So maybe we need additional weeks. Also just want to factor in a diet break, factor in being ready 2 weeks out. So, I mean, there were considerations, but ultimately starting her at like 240 or 250, whatever it was, like starting her at that cardio output to begin with, I was like, I don't love this. And would it technically be perceived, like the prep itself, would it be easier if, let's say, she wasn't at that, if she was only at 60 minutes a week or 80 minutes a week, just like a significantly less amount? Yeah, because that workup from whatever it is, like let's just say 80 minutes a week up to 180, that's 100 minutes of cardio I'm talking about on a weekly basis. It's 100 minutes of cardio that we didn't get. Like, we gave up, we wrote off. So I think like for me, where I'd like people to come to me at, or like where I'd like them to get to in their off season, where they're not going above this, like really like 100 minutes, give or take, like 120, 2 hours of cardio a week. I get it. Like, some of my smaller clients, like, we got to keep some in, because it's like, otherwise their food is going to be like 1,400. It's not going to get very high. Maybe pull it up to 15, 16. But if we were to completely remove it, like looking at their BMR, like maybe it's 1,000 calories. Like, I don't want to keep fat loss agents in their off season. We have to play with that, like that balance. We'll also have to consider their hunger signaling. It's great if someone is able to sit at lower calories and they're not like a high calorie intake isn't necessitated, also being a small individual. But for small individuals, like, it's not some smaller individuals, like they are going to need different tools in place in that non-fat loss setting in order to support their ability to stay adherent. Best case scenario, I do have lots of athletes who, like, we don't push cardio incredibly high in season. Therefore, they're in a state where they're peak off season doing under 60 minutes of cardio. We're able to consistently bring it down. This is only possible if their adherence, their food reporting is really dialed in. It's going to be incredibly hard to do this if someone's adherence is spotty, if consistently they're having overages, unplanned overages in prep. I mean, like, it's so rare for me to, and I think, like, again, it goes back to the smaller clients, is like, it's so rare to have someone go up to an hour a day for 6 days a week. 60 minutes, I mean, like, it's not great. And like, even within that, like, I'm not having them do stairs if they're at such a high volume. Like, the modality is definitely considered. For me, I preferred doing cardio 7 days a week, my last prep. I preferred that because I was like, that 7th day, if I'm doing 30 minutes, if I were to divide that over 6 days, or if I take, let's say at peak, I was at 60 minutes, 7 days a week, a very brief time, like not a long time at all. I mean, it's an additional 10 extra minutes. But yeah, 10 extra minutes each day at 60 minutes the 7th day, then breaking that up. Personally, like, I was just like, I'd rather do it the 7th day. I mean, like, I know, like, some people are really insistent, like, I need that full day off. And like, yeah, maybe there's an indication. For me, it felt like this is a better trade-off doing it that 7th day. But it's not to say some people, like, maybe it is necessitated. Maybe the rate at which they're losing doesn't allow for them to keep cardio under an hour a day for 6-7 days a week. Maybe at the peak, that's what they get to. But off the bat, I don't love it. I don't love it at all. Now, what about calories? Now, this is one that I gotta say, largely dependent on frame, like how tall you are, how big you are, how much muscle you have. I was one of those people that for the longest time was very afraid and very timid when it came to pulling food past a certain point. Early on in my career, this threshold was like 1400. I did not like the idea of going under that. Even earlier than that, like even in prep, I was like, oh, like 1200, that makes me anxious. And it's okay to have these like points of contention where you're like, hey, under this threshold, I'm going to struggle with adherence just off the basis of knowing how little I'm eating. And then that causing anxiety, causing fear, like what if I continue having to drop under this? So with this consult, because it was a one-time consultation, like with her, she told me like that number for her was 14. She's like, under 1400, I get very antsy. So she's like, going to 1,000, even going to 1,100, to me, that is very concerning. That made adherence that much more challenging. And I think it's important really to know for yourself what that minimum is and communicate that with your coach, or even have systems in place so that you're not having to sit under whatever your baseline is, your threshold, not baseline, what your threshold is for extended durations. If it's for a couple weeks, okay, not the end of the world. If you can hack it. If it's for a couple weeks and adherence is already spotty, it's not a great idea. This is all talking about like in the context of a fat loss phase. What about in the case of off season, of a growth phase? What's the minimum that I would want someone at? Because I don't really know if we can say like definitively there's a max, but what's the minimum in which I would have someone sit? I mean, for those smaller individuals, for those girlies who are like, 5 foot, 5'1", 5'2", like they're itty bitty. I mean, like that is going to be significantly less than someone who is, 5'4", 5'5", 6'6", 5'8". It should systematically, be worked up considering someone's frame. I want someone to obviously like at least be at a 500 calorie bump from whatever that threshold is. So if someone's threshold is like, I can't go under 1,1400, well, I would like them to be 1,1900, give or take. But that's factoring in like, hey, when we start a deficit, if we don't change anything with cardio, if we leave cardio constant and we go down 500 calories a day, okay, that is our 500 calorie deficit. That's our 1 pound a week gone just off that alone. That's not including fat loss agents. That's not including step count. Now, can it be higher than this? Yes, of course. Can adding muscle make that process, make it give you a little bit more runway on escalating, like pushing food up? Yes. But I think like we have to be reasonable about that. Like when I did my intentional growth phase, like last year, my food was like 2,200. I wasn't doing any cardio. And the reason is because I was like, structured cardio will inherently take away from my ability to train. Like it is like by proxy, any calories that I eat will be burned from cardio. How does that facilitate better training outcomes? It doesn't. I would love it if I was just strictly focusing on performance, which I was, and I think most people should. I would love it if every calorie that went into my body was being leveraged and put towards a better training outcome. So thereby I made the sacrifice. God, I hate how that sounds. Thereby I chose to not be as aggressive with increasing food in order to not have to have that cardio in place. If I'd had an extra 20 minutes a day, sure, I could have pushed food up. But the way I see it, I look at it kind of like the utility of like time versus value. I'm like, well, I'm doing that extra 20 minutes, which is not a lot, but like it still is time in a day that frankly, if I wasn't doing that, I could spend that 20 minutes doing something that facilitates a better training outcome. For me, that value was more important. Gaining like, okay, I get that extra 20 minutes to mobilize and not even do something actively, but just rest, to just recover. Amazing. Granted, like my step count was still like 8 to 10,000. Like it's not like my step count was 3,000. In that case, I'd be like, yeah, we need to move around a little bit more, because food wouldn't have even gotten to that point if step count was also severely low. My point is, there is an inherent cost to making that trade-off in season and off season, calories versus cardio, input versus output. And that goal is still ultimately in both phases. In season, the goal is to uphold training performance. And sorry, I realize like in season's a little ambiguous. In season, during a fat loss phase, the goal is still to uphold that performance. Because anytime performance goes down, anytime that we're seeing over the course of several months that we're losing reps, we're losing weight. Granted, as weight goes down, I mean, that can still even in itself be a form of progressive overload. But if performance is severely compromised, it's not great from a muscle preservation perspective. Prior to this, I was very much of the belief that I didn't have the discipline, the willpower to sit at lower calories for an extended period of time. And I kind of talked about this in the last episode in 15, that like your belief in this is going to largely dictate your perception of if diet is easier or harder. So personally for me, like what I found is I could do this two ways. I could work on my belief by creating the evidence needed to show myself like I can be adherent even at 1,400, 1,500 early into a diet. I can do that. Yes. Ultimately, that's going to be a variable that is much more reflective and easier to control versus output, because as you go through a diet, cardio is going to get harder. Sure, you might have sessions that don't suck as bad, but like the leaner you get, the more fatigue that's accumulating. Your perception around cardio and it being harder, that will go up. Like no one is getting to the end of a diet and they're like, yeah, you know what? Cardio is much easier than at the beginning when I was fatter, when food was higher. Typically people are finding whenever they begin to experience like more difficult times being adherent to a cardio regimen, it's likely due to the fatigue that is then accumulated from just the state that they're in. So like with prior coaches, when I got my pro card, cardio was excessive out the gate. And I think this actually is why I feel so strongly about this. Like the first month of working with that coach, like during that prep, I mean, like the goals were very muddied. Like I was very much of the belief where in prep, cardio kept going up, and it was something like the coach would ask me, like, do you want to increase cardio or lower food? And I continued to say increase cardio. So in a very short amount of time, I was at 30 minutes, 35, 40, 45, 50 minutes of cardio 6-7 days a week, which didn't make a lot of sense to me, because I'm like, I'm working, like I'm doing all this cardio. I'm actually like putting in the time and I'm burning calories. But the focus, like looking back, like we were also increasing calories, which, okay, that doesn't really make sense, because yeah, during prep, the question was, do you want to lower food or increase cardio? There were times early on in that prep where instead the notion was like, okay, here's the cardio regimen you're at. Okay, you're gaining weight. Let's push up food. And for me, it didn't make a lot of sense. This is the part, sorry. It's been a day. This is the part that really didn't make sense to me. We were going through this process of systematically working food up, yet it felt as if we were just ignoring the amount of cardio I was doing. So, I mean, eventually it became the point where like, okay, now we're going to turn it up. Now we're going to drop food. And it was like, okay, but like, I'm getting kind of tired. Even though I've been eating a lot, I am kind of tired in the sense that like, I'm also doing a shitload of cardio for whatever state, whatever kind of phase, pre-prep phase we're in, which that was not there's no conversation around that to be like, oh yeah, like this is why we're doing what we're doing. It was just cardio is at this baseline. Food is continuously being worked up. And just from an efficiency standpoint, it didn't It didn't add up to me. And this kind of ties into the other aspect that I think we really need to consider, and that is when we're doing this cardio. So previously, I have always been a fan of like, okay, if you're doing cardio, let's have it on a system of like, you're going to do it at this frequency, X number of days per week, X number of days in a separate session, and then X number of days post lifting. This in itself, it can work. And I think it can be necessary at times. However, what I found is I got busier as I took on more responsibilities in business. When I started nursing school, I found that there were more days that initial plan, it wasn't tracking. Like I wasn't able to consistently execute. And it's something I see with clients pretty often is like, maybe they're able to sustain it for a couple weeks, but then whenever I see that someone is like really struggling, they're like, okay, we've cardio 5-6 days a week. And they're like 3 of these days, those sessions ultimately had to be moved around and not in the way that we wanted them to, like turning into, oh, well, I didn't hit cardio or I didn't hit my lift before work or before, a long day. Therefore I had to package in 1.5 hour lift and then follow that up with 60 minutes of cardio because it's at the end of the week and I'm running out of time, and I'm actually making up a little bit of time for this session earlier in the week because I was only able to do 45 minutes and not the additional 15 minutes. And it's things like that ultimately you do that enough. And now this cardio regimen is becoming a pain point. It's becoming an area within your programming that you're not able to adhere to. Now, at some point, I don't really remember when this was, like in my prep in 21, when I turned pro, it was definitely cardio X number of times a week at this duration, which I think is pretty like industry standard. When I prepped myself in 2022, I switched over to just having a weekly amount of cardio to do. And instead of being like, okay, it's going to happen at this frequency, ultimately I did work it back and I'm like, okay, my rest days, I want some cardio to be done. My lower days, I don't want a ton of cardio to be done. My upper days, I can justifiably do a little bit more cardio as opposed to lower days. Cool. So then segmenting based on my schedule. Okay, what are the days that I can do 2 a days? What are the days I can create a big enough gap in between just a cardio workout, like going to the gym to do cardio and doing my actual lift? Because there needs to be a good amount of time. Like I'm not a fan of like fasted cardio at like 5 a.m. and then my lift at noon. Sometimes it had to happen that way. And some clients, like that's what their schedule is. We have to accommodate, or I choose to accommodate that. But it would be more ideal if there's more time in between those 2 sessions if you are doing 2 a days. The least favorable structure would be doing this lower body lift that takes a considerable amount of time and then following it up with a long duration of low intensity steady state cardio. High intensity would be even less favorable, but you get what I'm saying. Giving clients the ability to work it into their schedule, giving myself the ability to work it into my schedule as able to, not as needed, but like truly like what makes the most sense in terms of getting enough sleep. Because that's another thing, like telling someone to like, okay, you need to do 2 a day, 7 days a week, not 7 days a week, 6 days a week. Telling someone that you need to do 2 a day, 6 days a week, it's like, okay, well, you are ultimately going to sacrifice sleep on the days that you have to wake up extremely early in order to do that longer session of cardio. At a certain point, if sleep is at all compromised, which we can assume that in a fat loss phase and a contest prep, it will likely be compromised. Well, then we have to ask, okay, like what are we sacrificing in order to have this very fixed cardio schedule? And if we're sacrificing something that ultimately is going to affect adherence and training performance, what is the opportunity cost of not having that client wake up every single day, just the beginning of the day, first day, doing it fasted? Would it make sense to do a little bit of cardio pre-workout, a little bit post-workout? Because if we're talking about low intensity steady state, if we're talking about like 5% incline, 3 miles an hour on the treadmill, okay, that's something I'm very comfortable with a client, like going into their workout and doing a few minutes, like doing 5 to 10 minutes pre, 5 to 10 minutes post. Okay, you train for 4 or 5 days a week, that in itself, that kind of approach where you're just like systematically chipping away, ultimately is going to make it to where hopefully at least one of those fasted sessions where you like likely would be sacrificing sleep, hopefully that would be enough to at least give you some kind of return, give you a little bit more recovery from like a weekly standpoint relative to sleep. It's super cliche to be like, no, this approach is highly individualized, but at least for me, at least for my clients, I mean, like I've been coaching people this way for about 2 years where I'm just like, hey, here's your weekly target cardio. This is what you need to do. It is structured. This is not interchangeable with step count. It's not something you can be like, well, I'll get 20,000 steps in today and not do the structured cardio. Like the exchange rate, it's not equitable. But giving them that autonomy to fit it into their schedule, assuming it is lists and assuming that they understand like heart rate targets and those kind of things, ultimately, I think is a superior way in the essence of they're going to then be able to put it into their schedule at their convenience. And if we're just simply looking at cardio as a means to burn calories, which that's what it is, like, I mean, we're not building muscle. Like, just, I had a question about that yesterday. It's like, nope, not building muscle doing that. I think in the long run, that ultimately is going to allow for more of that discipline, that willpower to be preserved. And at the very least, there's an argument to be made that the sleep that we're going to get in turn by, assuming that the client is able to then structure it that way, if their schedule allows for it, there's going to be a bigger return on having consistent sleep. Sleep is going to be one of our greatest tools in order of in terms of managing fatigue. And if we're sacrificing fatigue management in order to burn more calories, specifically through structured cardio, we really have to consider, okay, have we exhausted all of these other tools that ultimately aren't going to inherently drive up fatigue just by the act of doing said thing? Sleeping more will lower fatigue. That will give you that restoration. Having food at a certain threshold, yes, that can drive up fatigue, but personally, I would much rather control the variable that is not going to incrementally drive up more and more fatigue, assuming that we can keep it above that client's baseline, whatever that baseline is for them. You guys know how I feel about it. Make it make sense. Sometimes it's not going to be pretty. Sometimes you are going to have to sacrifice sleep. Sometimes in order to create the deficit, you might have to push past what is comfortable. But I really think when we're talking about creating that deficit, if we aren't considering the impact that cardio is going to have from a fatigue management standpoint, we're severely overlooking that tool being fatigue management and its impact on our ability to bring our best physique to stage, or to bring our best physique to whatever point it is at the end of a fat loss phase. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope this was helpful. Any and all questions, feel free to drop them below. Thank you guys for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, leave me a review. As always, I will see you in the next one.